Hello, I'm Greg Fordham, the founder of Celestial Defense. Just in case you've not figured it out yet, today I'm going to discuss cyber incident reporting under the DFARS rules. Everything I discuss today is taken from the articles on my website about the DFARS rules, as well as from my seminar manual titled The Expert's Guide to Digital Evidence, the Almost Complete Works. Due to the constraints of time, my presentation is not as detailed as my articles or my manual. Consequently, I encourage you to view them later whenever it's convenient for you. If you do take a look at them though, please remember that these are just primers. So there's a lot more behind their concepts and secrets than I can reveal. Of course, I can't reveal all of my secrets. Please hold your questions to the end. I plan to finish before consuming all of my allotted time, and then I'll be glad to respond to any questions you might have. For now, however, climb aboard, strap in, and enjoy the ride.
Okay, well, I hope you enjoyed the intro. I bet you were starting to would wonder if I was actually going to have a speaking part in this presentation. Well, for most of it, you are going to be stuck with me, although I do have some more entertaining video later on, so please stand by, as they say. Now, for my presentation today, I thought I would split it into two parts. In the first part, I want to examine a kind of hypothetical, say, scenario as a way to set the table, so to speak. Now, the hypothetical will begin with a compromised system and review what has to be done to examine it. Once the table is set, I'll examine, say, the regulatory with requirements and the consequences of a cyber incident, as well as the reporting requirements. So let's see. My hypothetical today kind of begins with a phishing exploit, because these days they're very common and some of the most, say, successful type exploits. They can be easily fallen for, particularly if the bad guys have done a good job doing, say, their homework and have disguised an email message to look like it's coming to you from someone that you know. And perhaps the spoofed message contains, pictures, and then encourage you to open them, and when you do, the malware is dropped onto your system and kind of starts doing its dirty deeds. Now, perhaps what the malware does is, when it first gets there, is it changes, say, your registry so that it always runs at startup, and then it maybe starts to scan, say, your memory or kind of watch what your activities are to see if it can get your access to credentials. Its long-term goal is to travel across, say, the network to, say, with different machines and try to access them with, the credentials, say, that it acquires, so it can maybe find targets of interest. Presumably when it starts, the credentials it has are somewhat limited, and so it needs to somewhat obtain escalated credentials. And essentially, as it moves around, it tries to do the same types of stuff to find to the escalated credentials, because if it gets the right ones, then it can do virtually anything it wants to say whatever machines or the targets that it's found. Now, for our situation here, let's assume that it gets to an IP with data server, because essentially, say the misappropriation with intellectual property is supposedly, the big concern for the QE security standards and stuff like that. All right, so from the 171 with document at 314.5, you're supposed to be scanning, say, your system, like looking for threats, which is just what you would be doing. You'd probably expect to be doing there with your virus scanner. So you may be wondering, well, wouldn't my virus scanner pick up on this type of stuff? And well, maybe and maybe not, because actually virus scanners are thought to only be about 10 to 15% effective against like malware, because every day there's lots of new malware being, released, and it just takes time for it to be kind of identified and, cataloged and, say now, to analyzed and then to redistribute it back out to all those, say now, virus checkers. So, say a lot of times, the detection is not going to be based on some sort of simple virus checker type of operation. Rather, on 314.6, you're supposed to be monitoring the system within looking for behaviors that could indicate a potential attack. Of course, it takes time to identify those behaviors and to even say now would recognize them. And it could be things like a strange user access of system, like resources, or to communications outside of the network to the mothership, or just some strange file activity. But at some point, however, the malware gets detected, which triggers like a warning, and say it needs to be taken with a look at. It just takes kind of a while to figure it out because there's just a lot of data that goes on there, and trying to separate it to do the trip just can take some time. Now, the way these things go is it's usually about a 4-step process. There with the collection, you collect all the data, then you do the analysis of data to see is it normal, is it somewhat, say, like unusual. If it's going to be with unusual, it's escalated for someone to decide is it something that we think we need to take a further look at and do a go and no-go type decision. And if it is, then some sort of response is going to be launched. Now, while it's nice to have all of those, say, security controls, there are thousands of ways to steal stuff. And if you lock all of them down, someone's going to find 1,001. And in fact, the way they get through might not even be caused by a security with control failure. It could be a previously unrecognized vulnerability in a piece of hardware or software, including the intrusion with detection with system or other defensive with systems. So security controls are actually not really with barriers, but more like tripwires. And so that when a wire is tripped, you have to investigate the cause and determine what's happened, how did it get there, how long has it been here, what's it done. Now, even if, say, the detection is by, say, a virus checker, and it says, it's malware, it's not always just enough to say it's malware, say, delete it. There's always the follow-up with question as to what kind of malware was it, how did it get there, how long has it been there, what has it done, particularly if there's been any time lag between the time to the infection and the time it gets detected. So this is where the you say the real fun can start, kind of when the wire gets tripped, and you have to answer those questions. This is also where at least contractors are going to have a lot of problems, or start to have a lot of problems, and for a lot of good reasons. As it turns out, the in-house people may be good at doing, say the security controls, but they tend to be a little less sophisticated or well at doing, say, the forensics to figure this stuff out. In fact, in 2014, Ponymon published a survey of over 1,000 CIOs, and only 6% of the CIOs said that they would bring in an outside consultant to help them assess a data breach. But yet 74% of those 1,000 said that their in-house staff that would not be able to figure out what the cause and the consequence of the breach was in less than a year's time. And it's because they didn't have the right tools, the right training, or the experience. In my experience, even though it's 8 years after the Ponymon survey, it's really not too much better. People always tend to want to try to do the analysis themselves to figure out something, whether it goes upstream or not. but there's a lot of them that are going to try to spend an awful lot of time, like figuring it out, and it always kind of seems like, at least with some of them, and I realize I'm painting with a broad brush here, the longer they spend trying to figure it out, the worse things get. In fact, there's a military term for this, FUBAR. Maybe some of you have heard of that. So anyway, if till the detection is going on and it's a live, say, machine, maybe your first question or your first decision is, do I need to collect with memory? And if you're going to do that, you're going to be using special tools to do that collection to avoid the blue screen of death. And when you collect the contents, they're going to be dumped to an exterior, a data source, not back to your own, machine. Because, in fact, with any type of a data with collection, should be done so that the data on, say, the device is not changed, or at least, the changes are very minimal. If the machine is not going, then you probably can jump straight to the other data with collection techniques. Now, for the memory, types of analysis, there's a lot of stuff that you can do, and there's a lot of say now useful things that you can find out to confirm that you've got malware and understand better about what it's doing. But the memory is really just a short-term view. It's the here and now. If it's been there for some length of time, like for example, for the Sony stuff, that breach at least to have been at least like 6 months, so it could have been there for quite some time. So you may have to go elsewhere to figure out, what actually are the consequences of this stuff. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of devices from which data might have to be, say, collected. There are a lot of different ways to collect the data, and the data, is being principally done so you can look at it somewhat later using some more sophisticated tools. If you're doing kind of a damage assessment, it's probably unrealistic to think that you're going to do it all on a live machine, since some of the analysis work could actually take days to process all the data and for you to take a look at it. In addition, you don't want to confuse the crime scene, so to speak. So one of the most important things that you can do is, when you try to collect the data, do it without making changes to what's existing on the box. And you probably, if you're doing it live, you're probably stepping all over stuff, and you're changing stuff, all the time. It's pretty easy to do for like a Windows box, for example. And the other thing is, when you're doing the collections, you're not necessarily just out there trying to collect, say, the malware, because you're really trying to figure out what it's done and what the consequences have been. So you're probably going to be collecting everything. So that could be software files, data files, free space, slack space, all kinds of stuff. Okay. Now, one of the things that you'd be doing once you've collected the data, maybe doing file system analysis. And if the hard drive can be analogized, or the storage media, it doesn't necessarily have to be a hard drive, can be analogized to, say, like a library, the file system is kind of like the card catalog, and the files are like the books on the shelves. The file system of analysis looks through the card catalog to understand what the library actually contains. If it then compares the information to the books that it finds there, tries to figure out which ones are still there, if the ones that are still there are exactly kind of what they purport to be. If they're in boxes, it gets them unpacked. There also does to the cataloging. So there can be quite a number of different types of tests that the file system analysis does about, say, the card catalog and the library. Now, beyond that, you get into, say, device with system analysis, and that could be pretty much targeted towards the operating system. There with the event logs, it's one of the first places people tend to go to take a look at what's been going on in the machine, who's been doing it, how it's happening. But there are a lot of other, artifacts that, that need to be examined as well. So once you've done that, kind of like another one is going to be file activity with analysis. Essentially what the file activity analysis reveals is how the machine has actually been being used. And it looks, in other words, what it tries to examine is what files are being accessed, what things are being touched and accessed, say now on the machine. Though a lot of times, what we want to know is has the malware been inspecting stuff? Has it been touching stuff? When it touched it, is this something that it could potentially would have tried to transmit outside of the network? So, as I mentioned kind of previously, the file with system with analysis was performed where the storage of media was parsed and its contents kind of cataloged. With the file activity with analysis, the certain tests are performed, such as like date with distribution with analysis to see what's been changed and when it's been changed, when it was put there, has it been accessed since then, folder with deletion or file with folder with deletion, patterns to see if anything's been done to try to obscure or hide what's been going on, with including, say, like to the recycler with activity. Browser with history can also help to understand how the device, has been accessed, across the internet, but you're not necessarily just looking at the active cache for the browser. In fact, depending on the type of browser, the amount of active cache that you have to work with could be somewhat short, and so you're really going to be wanting to look at through all the deleted space to go through and parse all that and find previously, say, deleted types of records. This could be because, say, the malware is doing things to flush the cache to kind of hide the stuff it's doing, and then it could just be the normal housekeeping types of stuff. Some of the other things, and also for the Windows types of box, the browser cache, well, not the cache, but the records can also contain file access with types of information which could be useful to help you understand what's been going on. And it doesn't really necessarily just point to the machine. It points to any file that it might have touched on an attached device over, say, the network, does also as well. So if it's maybe gone out to access a server with somewhere, brought the file back and to beam it out or something like that, that could possibly show up through the browser with analysis. And of course, the link files, to say in the jump list, provide the same type of stuff as does say the shell bags, but that's just really just at a folder, a type of level. So recovering deleted data gets to be kind of an essential skill for forensic analysis, because one of the primary reasons is because there's kind of a lot of housekeeping that could be being done by the system just by operating it. So you might need to go and do the recovery to get further historical types of information to see what's happened, say, now on this machine. Also, it's not uncommon for the malware, when it gets there, to be, say, deleting stuff to try to cover, to say, its tracks. And so you need to be pretty capable of getting out there and trying to investigate free space within Slack space to find out kind of, say, now, what might be going on. Now, there are essentially two techniques for doing, say, the recovery for the deleted data, and that's going to be, file system with recovery, to the extent that the file system actually has that type of information for the Windows types of stuff with NTFS or FAT. You'd have that. If you get off into the Apple systems or the Linux types of stuff, probably not. The next one might be kind of like, a data carving, where you scan it looking for signatures, types of headers for files, and then try to bring those back to do the recovery for those. Say, on the downside, for the recovery aspect, it's not always as easy as it once was. There's a lot of things that are going on to the machines with these days that help obscure, say, the deleted data and kind of make it harder to get back. One is going to be storage space with optimization. In other words, as the media there has gotten bigger, your response and be able to pull data off that isn't just because of the hard drive speeds. It might also be that the operating systems there have gotten smarter as well about how they follow what you're doing and predict what you're doing, trying to optimize the data so it's in an easy and fast, say like recovery to position for you. But in the process of doing that, there's a lot of overriding being done, and that helps to obscure and make it more difficult to bring back, say, deleted data. Also, certain say security practices kind of say now make it difficult. Say, for example, if you have a disk encryption going on, typically for like your laptop, you probably have, say, a security control that you're going to put on their disk, say, encryption. Well, when you have that installed and that's going on, when a file gets, say, deleted, it just kind of falls into the soup, and it's really difficult, if not impossible, to be able to recover that. So, in fact, that kind of highlights some of the difference here, or something that need to be paying attention to, is that sometimes you need to be just, or at least when you're trying to configure, say, your security controls, you need to be just as, say, informed about, say, the forensic processes and what's going to be required to recover the data and to be able to figure out what's going on to a particular machine as it is, putting up these with tripwires and trying to keep things out. So there's a lot of times you'll, or at least what I see is I'll see people who pretty much just say configured stuff for the security controls, but they haven't been thinking long term about how we need to have certain, say, like recovery, types of aspects to make it easier for the forensic stuff after the fact to be able to figure out what's actually gone on. And then, of course, the last kind of thing is storage. With technology itself, things like an SSD drive is not the same as a fixed, a platter, and it can be more difficult to, just because of the SSD and the refresh rates and the way the data is always mentioned, move on that. It can make it more difficult to get, the information back off of that than, say, if it were just a spinning platter of a hard drive. Now, the other place you can go to get your data to do the analysis are going to be the routers, switches, firewalls, and even say the detection with systems themselves. But there are several different issues that you may kind of manage to find there that that are going to be somewhat kind of problematic for you. The first issue is about whether or not there's going to be, say, sufficient with history captured by these things. It's not, say, uncommon where, you come in and there was some incident that you've detected, but it happened like 2 days ago, and so you're trying to figure it out, and when you go to recover all the data, maybe all that's in there is the last two hours because of the volume that, that's going on there, and they haven't set it up enough to capture enough with history. Kind of a second issue could be that the types of events that are being captured is not all of the events, maybe only certain types of events what they're being captured. For example, it was often quite common to kind of set up to pick up like failures with their problems, but not pick up all the ones that got through. So you may see with something where here these failures that are going on, but if you haven't also caught all the ones that got through, you might not be able to know for sure, well, did they ever actually manage to get through or not? And the last one is that sometimes the volume of the data is like incomplete. For example, you may have a situation there with the packets where it's been, say, configured to retain, the packet with header, but you may not have the packet data and the payload as well. And so if you're looking to try to decide has this actually been transmitted outside of the network, you've got a problem trying to actually to conclude that or not. All right, so if you actually find, say, some malware, you're going to want to know something kind of about it. Now, probably, say, your virus checker, if it's found by that, will at least tell you, or would tell you whether it's a Trojan or worm or something like that. If it's something that you're off, just something's tripped, and you're trying to figure something out and what's happened, well, in the process, you might come up and find that there is actually, say, some malware here. In that case, you're going to want to know something more about it. I mean, even in terms of the virus, you want to know something, like more about it. There are a couple of ways that you may be able to figure that out. For example, you can maybe do static with binary analysis. There are tools for doing that, and they may be able to kind of tell you, does this binary have what features for operating below the application level, or does it have what features for managing to communicate, directly to the storage device which if it has those types of things, some of the things that I just talked to you about aren't going to do you kind of any good. And you already know that you need to adjust, say, your analysis for more low level with types of data. And of course, the other option is to put it into kind of a, say a sandbox, environment and see what it's doing, what it's meant to communicate with, and that kind of thing. And I guess it's good that you may not have to set one of those up yourself. There's plenty of public ones that you'd be able to rent or pay for to actually see what's going on. All right, so now let's take a look at what the DFARS rules actually requires if you have some of this stuff. Now, all the say the QE with requirements are in the say the 7012 clause, and I'll just go through to start off. Paragraph A is say the definitions. Paragraph B is say the security controls. The adequate with security that contractors are supposed to have, and you can see the CMMC is actually in the 7021 clause. It's paragraph C that we actually get into the cyber incident, like reporting. So, when a contractor discovers it's got, say, a cyber incident, it's supposed to conduct a review and, like rapidly report to DoD. So, what is a cyber incident? Well, if you get, say, a ransomware, that's probably a good indication you've had a cyber incident. But how about if your virus detector goes off and finds something? Does that mean that you've had with a virus checker? I mean, does that mean that you've had, say, a cyber incident? Well, there are two parts to trigger, say, the reporting with requirement. First is you got to have a cyber incident, and then it has to be something to affect, with a covered information system, CDI residing on the system, or some sort of operationally, say, critical element to the contract. So let's get a little further down here and say, okay, well, what is a cyber incident? Since the first step is you got to have a cyber incident. Well, a cyber incident is essentially defined as actions taken through the use of computer, networks that result in a compromise or an actual or potentially adverse effect on an information system and or the information residing thereon. And then it goes further in terms of a compromise. As you can see, essentially a compromise is some sort of unauthorized disclosure, or it's the, something resulting from a violation of a security policy. Well, that's kind of, in my mind, that's kind of saying now a nebulous from the standpoint that the security policy identifies the rules and procedures used by the individuals for using and accessing with an organization's IT resources. So in other words, the security policy could be that you're going to be patched on your operating systems and be up to date there with your operating systems. And what happens if whatever's gone on to your network is because of some previously unrecognized vulnerability in that operating system? Are you going to have violated, say, your security policy at that point? Probably not. And then how detailed, say, a security policy might your, say, your organization have? It might not actually be that detailed in terms of what you have. So, and then the second, or once you've got, say the cyber incident, the other thing is the second part of it. It affects a covered, information system, which is an unclassified information system that's owned or operated by the contractor. This kind of gets down to the good point that I like to tell people about trying to segment, say, your network. There's no need to try to have with the entire organization on the same kind of a network. If your greeter with outside falls for some kind of, say now, phishing exercise, it'd be a lot better for you if you had maybe segmented it to the network and done a better job trying to protect your CDI. surveilling that system. And even say the definition of CDI is rather convoluted and complex. So I would also look to that quite strictly in terms of trying to assess whether or not you've had a cyber incident. Now, it's somewhat interesting that the rule for a cyber incident has been unchanged since the 2013 version of the rules. In case you weren't aware, there's been a 2013 version, a 15, a 16, and now a 19 version. And the cyber incident rule is pretty much unchanged since 2013, although technically the 2013 version, didn't include the term compromise. And in fact, the term compromise didn't come into the definition of a cyber incident until the 2016 version. Although for the reporting with requirement, compromise was always part of the trigger for the reporting, requirement. So to a certain extent, compromise, there has always been part of, say, the cyber, incident and a trigger for the reporting with requirement. Now, the 2013 rule also included a couple examples of a cyber incident. One of those examples was somewhat of a catch-all, that essentially made any sort of unauthorized network access a cyber incident. Those examples would disappear after the 2013 version. They're not in 15, 16, or 19. And quite frankly, I'm not so sure that simply an unauthorized access of the network meets the definition of a cyber incident. Now, you may kind of wonder why I'm up here and I'm doing all this clever, gymnastics to try to define what the cyber incident is. Well, first, they give you all these words. I mean, if a cyber incident was essentially there was an unauthorized, disclosure, there was an unauthorized copying, and a second unauthorized access, why not just simply say that? Instead, we have all these rules. I mean, DOD is a sophisticated rule writer, although if you've worked in this field for a long time like I have and worked with me in programs, sometimes you question what that capability is actually like. But they are a sophisticated rule, rule writer, and they should know how to say what they mean. And so if they meant an unauthorized disclosure, there was an unauthorized copying, and there was an unauthorized access, that could just be pretty straightforward put into the rule, but it's not. Now, once you've got a cyber incident, or something else you're supposed to do, you're supposed to conduct a review for the evidence of the compromise of the covered defense information, the CDI. Now, the forensic analysis is supposed to protect the integrity of the data. As I say, you're going to end up having a lot of contractors who have trouble with that, because I see that I tell people, I have courses and I teach people, how to handle this stuff, and invariably they will, they go at it live. They start with it live or something like this, and they'll spend days, weeks, doing this stuff, and they're just destroying stuff from the start. So, but as you can see, the whole process can be somewhat involved, as illustrated with the previous discussion there with on incident response, and it's simply not enough to say delete, have your virus checker pop up something and say here's some malware. It's not enough for it to capture, to delete it. You really still need to go through the process to figure out what's happened, how long it's been there, has it accessed, has it somehow compromised any of the other, CDI. Also, would notice that it does not involve just the analysis of the initial system. You're expected to go out and look at all the systems that may have been accessed from the compromised system. So you pretty much have to go through, say, the forensic analysis that I was talking about to try to figure out, well, what has this thing been accessing? What other devices do I need to investigate as well? Now, the actual implementation of this process for the forensic review is going to be interesting in the CMC, since the third-party certification will probably become just as meaningless as the honor with system if we don't have good integrity, or if, say, the forensic with analysis aspect is not seriously well undertaken, or maybe is designed from the start to fail and not actually find that you had a situation of a cyber incident. Now, if you decide that you've had with a cyber incident, and quite frankly, you'll have to do the forensic analysis to determine if you have. I mean, how else will you know if you've actually had a compromise a lot of times? All right, then you're supposed to say now rapidly report, and you're going to be able to do that, as I said, through the DIB with Net portal. You'll need kind of, say, a medium assurance certificate to be able to connect to the portal and to complete your report. Depending on the version of the contract, depending on the version of the clause that you might have in your contract, you could be doing 20 fields or 30 fields. Most of them are ID type stuff: contractor, contract, location, blah blah blah. But there are a few questions about what did you actually find and what the impact of this is on your CDI. Now, you might have thought that by the time you did your report that you're done, but actually this stuff goes on. There's more requirements for you to turn in and disclose beyond that. The first one starts here in paragraph D, and that is to provide, say, the malicious software. So if you encounter, say, the malicious with software, you're supposed to manage to provide that to the DoD Cyber Crime Center, DC3. It says, do not send it to the contract officer. Don't put it on a flash drive and send it to the contract officer. Now you can contact the contract officer and ask, what do I do with it? But don't send it to the contract officer. He should give you instructions about how to send it to DC3, for example. Now, chances are you might not have. You might have. I mean, since you only have to have like 72 hours to do the reporting, you may or may not have been able to figure out if you've got, say, the malicious software, or find, say, the malicious software. Whatever your event is, you may be able to figure out that you've got a cyber incident. You may be able to figure out that you've got a compromise. You may be able to figure out something's happened, but you may not have yet found, say, the malicious, say, now software. But you'll certainly have to somewhat go ahead and do the forensic analysis to figure that out. Now, I should point out also, notice in here for the definition for the malicious with software that it includes things like viruses, worms, trojans, and spyware. So if your virus checker goes off and tells you it's a trojan or it's a worm, do you have a cyber incident? Maybe not. But does it mean you have to do the forensic analysis? It probably triggers, say, the forensic analysis. You got a problem. You need to go do, the forensic analysis. All right. So the next thing you have to do within paragraph E is for any of the affected systems, you're supposed to preserve the images. So remember, when you started doing the analysis, when you image these systems, and the images contain pretty much, there'll be a few exceptions, but you can pretty much guess, particularly if it's a desktop and the server isn't too big and whatever else, it's got all the data that's there. So you're supposed to preserve the images, and you're supposed to preserve them for at least 90 days. Notice don't preserve them for 90 days, it's preserve them for at least 90 days. And in fact, when you get down there further, it says to allow DoD to request the media or decline interest. So you're going to keep these for God knows how long, quite frankly. And it doesn't really say what DoD is going to do with them. Well, anyway, so you have to keep them, for a long time. And remember, there with your other kind of contract date is usually 3 years after final payment. Well, there's no such type of limitation here, apparently. I don't see this here. You might have to keep this for gosh knows how long. All right. So the other thing that you might have to do is, upon request by DoD, you might have to provide DoD with access to additional information or equipment that's necessary for it to conduct a forensic analysis. So maybe you don't do, I mean, there's no instruction here as to what's going to trigger this request. Maybe you don't do a good job with your forensic analysis. Maybe you haven't gone through and figured out the malware yet. Who knows what it is? But whatever it is and they want it, they can come in and look at additional information and equipment and image that for forensic analysis. All right, so that gets kind of, think about that in terms of what might be on those images. Remember, these images contain everything. So it might not only be your proprietary data that you've never given to DoD, it might be other proprietary data, maybe with a customer that you have that you've signed an NDA, a non-disclosure type of agreement. Well, DoD can come in and essentially take this. That it could be payroll information on key personnel. Who knows what's on there? There's all kinds of stuff on there. 'Cause some of it could be quite embarrassing, quite frankly. Let's say it's a desktop, that's been confiscated or that isn't somehow involved in this that they want to look at, and you want to know how people are actually spending their time at work. You can figure that out by looking at their machine quite easily. And if it's their laptop, well, you want to know how they're using their laptop after they get beyond the firewall policies at work. Maybe when they're off on travel somewhere, it could be quite interesting. But the point is they can come in, they can get all this data. Now, kind of say, like, remarkably, it doesn't stop there, because you may also have to give, if DoD wants to do its own damage assessment, you have to give them copies of the images and the data that you collected to do the analysis. So it goes on and on. And just remember that you're going to give them the stuff, and your judgment could be quite different from theirs about whether or not what they're going to need it or what's been accessed. And quite frankly, if it's something that DoD wants to come and manage to collect, if it's been a long time since the event happened, and maybe they're looking at access or who knows what, a lot of this data, because of the routine housework that's going, house cleaning that's going on, on these systems, and if nothing else kind of, say, has been triggered on it, there really might not be anything that they're going to be able to find if they come in 6 months after you've done the analysis and they want to look at something more, for example. So now, the other thing that's somewhat interesting about this is in the 2013 version of the rule, the contractor had an exit. In other words, he could, say, like, resist providing this data, provided there was some legal with restriction, say, that limited the company's, say, ability to provide the data, such as maybe you have an NDA. Perhaps the image contains data for a customer, and you've got a non-disclosure with agreement that you're not supposed to give that out to anybody. Or perhaps it's got with HIPAA information or other PII or something like this. There could be other restrictions that would prohibit you. But amazingly, this exemption is gone now. It's not been in the rules since 2013. It's not in 15, 16, or 19. So, now, what DoD has come in with instead is paragraph H at the safeguarding contractor information. And essentially, what it says there is it recognizes that it could be getting this highly sensitive contractor data. And DoD says that it will implement appropriate procedures to minimize the contractor attribution or proprietary information, although it never discloses what those procedures are going to be, what controls it's going to have. And it certainly doesn't disclose what it's going to do if it screws up. Now, remarkably, it kind of segregates this stuff a little further. And we have things like it looks at what is DoD going to do if it involves, contractor information that was not prepared for DoD. Okay? And essentially it puts these things out there. And most of them are to, essentially DoD says it's going to be authorized to release the information outside of DoD. Outside, and most of them are like law enforcement types, and maybe people that you'd say, oh yeah, I'd like to help out or whatnot. But how about that first bullet point up there? To entities with missions that may be affected by such information. I don't even know what that means, but I'll bet I could drive a battleship sideways through it if I had to. You know, so they're going to get they can get all kinds of stuff, stuff that you may have never given to them in the past, with exemptions to the forward data rights clauses, source code, manufacturing details, all sorts of proprietary data. And it doesn't have to just be yours. It could be your customers. It could be, maybe, even if you're a contractor that does a combination of government work and, say, commercial stuff, if you're saving this stuff on the same server or the same machines or whatever, and they end up in here, you can end up turning all of this information over to them as well. And they really don't even provide you any kind of assurance about what they're going to be doing or how they're going to be using it, other than to tell you, we could give it to anybody we want. Really is what they say. So now if it's information that's for DOD, that's derived for DOD, they pretty much tell you the same thing, that it can be released outside of DOD. So if it's information you've done on your contract, they don't necessarily make any differentiation about whether it's covered by the forward data rights clauses with or not. It could have been stuff, some of it could be stuff that you were going to turn over anyway, but it could also be stuff that you're not going to, that you had no plans of turning over. There's a lot of this type stuff. For example, in the hardware world, DoD is not supposed to be able to take the data and, say, procure there with it if you've got, say, restricted access to it. They're not supposed to be able to take your data and send it to some other vendor, so they can, manufacture and they can kind of cut you out. And so even though you might have had to provide some data so they could do stuff, a lot of times it's high-level assembly types of data. It's not really fabrication details. It may not be source code details. If you're a first-tier sub or a sub further down the tier, you may have been managing to work with a very, say, benevolent customer, but you don't turn this data over to your customer. You turn this, so the point is, if you had, say, a benevolent customer, you may have worked out some sort of nice accommodation in terms of what data you turn over to them, for them to then forward to DOD as part of whatever contract, deliverable they have. But you don't turn this data over to your customer. If you're a subcontractor at any term, when you're reporting to DOD directly. You're not reporting upstream with contract, like privity and stuff like this. You're going directly to DOD and providing all this information. So, anyway. All right, so just kind of to round it out, so you can see that, there are about 13 paragraphs in the 7012 clause, and 8 of them are actually involving what happens with a cyber incident, reporting. Let's just kind of round out the last 3 here. And that is one of the things in paragraph K, you're expected to comply with the electronic communication laws. Now that, I don't know how much you guys are into that, but essentially what they're probably talking about here is the Electronic Communication Protection Act of 1986. Okay, and so essentially Title I of that prohibits wiretapping. Early on in the process, I talked about how you get packet information. You may only be managing to collect headers on packets. Content, if you're collecting content, you're potentially violating Title I in your wiretapping. So you may not be supposed to be doing that to begin with. So, which that would make for an interesting policy thing. This the statute comes out of 1986, which was even before Al Gore invented the internet, right? So that's just a little humor there. Hope you can play along. We are among friends here. Okay. Now, L is that this is not exclusive, and by that I would mean is that the FAR has its own sets of computer rules and security with requirements. What's in the FAR now? My understanding, I had a little different view than our previous speaker, I thought the FARS essentially covers essentially 4 or 5 of the domains that are in the 171, and so kind of say now level 1 was going to essentially cover those 4 or 5. But anyway, the point is that the 7012 clause is not exclusive, and you could also be covered by something else, whether it's the FAR stuff or maybe there's even some additional contract types of requirements. Maybe it could even be the classified stuff, the classified types of requirements that you have. And then, of course, paragraph M is the subcontract, like flow downs. So, all right. So let's kind of talk about the cyber incident response versus cyber incident reporting. Now, in the 171 rules, there is a section 3.6 that talks about incident response, and 3.6.1 refers to certain NIST documents, and essentially, the contractor is supposed to have an incident response capability. Now, as I said before, it's going to be interesting to see with the CMMC and these third-party, like certifiers, what kind of view they take on this. Because when you look at these particular NIST documents, the 861, the 101, the 161, these are, in my mind, these are, maybe good book cover material. I wouldn't even put them in the category of book 1, page 1, type of material. It's not really very substantive. I don't think it's very, if you're going to hold a contractor to that type of a level of sophistication, you're not holding them to much sophistication at all. So, and as I said, it's going to be interesting to see kind of how they go with this type of stuff and what's required, because if you can get CMMC and you not have to have a with a robust tough forensic capability, I'm not really too sure we're going to be accomplishing much in terms of this third like party with certification deal, because everything is going to be probably designed to fail, or it's not going to actually be detected. Just kind of sharing you a couple of war stories. I don't even want to talk about this field because we don't have enough of experience, but years ago when the HIPAA stuff came out, I worked on a number of projects where just for example, one where someone had found that they had actually attached a device with all this kind of, say, this medical with data on a data port on a router, and the data port faced the public, faced the open, the internet. And they figured out that they had made this mistake when some of their data starts, or at least some of the information started showing up on Google searches. So you would think this is a very clear HIPAA problem with the disclosure issues, but yet, you can go and you find people who will come in and do an analysis, and they'll put all kinds of blinders on, and they'll determine that while it was out there, it never got disclosed. It never was compromised. It never was this, that, and the other. So that's why I say it's going to be interesting to see how this actually gets implemented with the CMC requirements down the line, and what it really takes for you to get your certification. The next thing is the 171 at 3.6.2 also has a requirement to report incidents, but it doesn't really give any details. It says report incidents in accordance to the governing authority or something kind of nebulous like that. So essentially, when you get down to it, what you're going to be following is what's in 7012. The CMMC isn't going to be very helpful to you. I mean, the 171, the requirements aren't going to be helpful to you understanding that. So, okay, how about the incident scope? I think a lot of times people, when they think about these cyber incidents, they're thinking only in terms of their endpoints and loose files. But actually, this covers a broader range than that. It can get into your business systems, things like your accounting, HR, your engineering, your configuration, your manufacturing, all this type of stuff. And I know a lot of people may think that it's fairly safe because of the user controls and stuff like this. But actually, a lot of these systems are kind of a database systems. And you've got the access controls coming through the user interface. But you know how to go through the back end, and it's really not that complicated. you go through the back end, this stuff is wide open usually. I've worked on I don't know how many of these and, you know, doing this type of stuff, and it's wide open. So, and the last thing is things like factory shop floor control, CNC equipment. Now, a lot of this stuff can be somewhat, say, proprietary maybe, in terms of their file systems and all sorts of stuff like this and how they're used with stuff. So, you know, that kind of tosses kind of another, you know, like wrinkle in for your IT people. They may be able to help you with your endpoints, but especially that you might have to be able to satisfy, you know, your shop, say your CNC and your shop floor control is a totally different matter. So, all right.
I hope you have enjoyed our excursion into cyber incident reporting under the DFARS rules. As you can see, we're headed back to the carrier and will be landing shortly. While most people have focused on the various security controls imposed by NIST 800-171 publication and the CMMC, there are likely bigger concerns once you have your first cyber incident. It's not so much the reporting per se, or that you have to submit a report with some kind of secure certificate, or even that you'll have to perform some kind of forensic analysis as part of your incident response, which most likely your own IT people won't know how to do. Rather, the really big bugaboo is if you have to provide to DoD all of the forensic images you made and the data you examined as part of your incident response and forensic analysis. Even worse could be if you have to provide DoD with wide-ranging access to your data and equipment for them to conduct their own imaging and forensic analysis. Where it gets really scary is when all that data and equipment contains highly sensitive proprietary data that you have never previously provided to DoD under exceptions to the FAR data rights clauses. Even worse could be that DoD uses a contractor to perform its assessment and to review all your data and equipment, and that contractor is a different branch of a major competitor or customer who you have historically stiff-armed from conducting various audits for competitive reasons. They say it's not a matter of if you will have a cyber incident, but when you will have a cyber incident. Once you consider the cyber incident reporting rules, you have to wonder, from whom are you really protecting your network? That answer might be trickier than a carrier landing.
Okay, so how does the 24, maybe that was something I probably meant to hit on that a little bit more. I view the 72-hour deal as from the time that you determine you have a cyber incident. So you have to determine that you have one first. And then when you determine you have one, the clock starts. It's certainly going to be very short time. I mean, I think it's a little fast, myself, but if you've already determined that you got one, I would certainly think, if you look at the fields that are supposed to be filled out, I would think you could probably fill them out. 72 would be better. It would give you more time, particularly if you find with malware, to make some assessment of it and exactly more about it, 72, the 24 is, it's probably unrealistic. You can do it. You'll probably know if you have a cyber incident, you know a lot of details about it, but come on, it takes time. It takes sometimes days to figure this stuff out. So, okay.
Greg, thank you very much. We're here in the full 60 minutes. Please scan your badge in. For those that want to self-certify, again, you can self-certify on this. But we go through the company scan your badge. basically, it should come up and just, I don't know, I guess you just moved it. He had to reload yours?
Yes.
Okay, so we may have to have him reload
flash
it.
drive, you might need to reload yours as well.
Okay.
That's
I don't
last
see
year
a
it worked.
mouse.
Yeah, I don't either.
It was working for me.
Now I'll get the IT folks, I'll give them a call.
Really? Is it frozen up or something?
Oh, oh.
There was something.
I saw something. Oh,
I don't-
it's probably, is there a, is the mouse on this screen?
I'm surprised you don't have a bunch of people running up here to talk to you.
Maybe it's gone with this thing. Maybe because I had the clicker. Let's pull it out and see if that helps.
Nope,
That doesn't solve it either, huh?
nope.
Let me get them in here, I'll give them a call. Let me go do that.
I stood there. No, he made, I mean, they said something about this portable mic. If you want to hold it and walk around, if you're a pacer like me or something like that.
I am a pacer, but this will anchor me, so that's fine.